Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Professor James Clark to the podcast to talk about the dissolution of the monasteries. James Clark is Professor of History at the University of Exeter, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Society of Antiquaries of London. His research traces the changing cultural, religious and social life of the Kingdom of England at the end of the Middle Ages and through the Tudor Reformation. His latest book is The Dissolution of the Monasteries, A New History. He regularly contributes to media on historical topics. He was historical consultant for the BBC TV series Tudor Monastery Farm. He contributed to Dame Hilary Mantel's BBC Wreath Lectures on history and literature, and he reviewed the TV adaptation of Mantel's Wolf Hall for The Conversation. Most recently, he's re-examined Henry VIII's Doomsday Survey, the 1535 Valor Ecclesiasticus, for History Today magazine. His new book, Monasterium, will be published by Penguin Random House in 2026. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, James. How are you?
It's very nice to be with you.
Yes, I've been looking forward to our chat. So it would be really wonderful to just begin with an introduction. If you could just tell our listeners a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. So I'm James Clark. I'm Professor of History at the University of Exeter in the UK, where I spend my time researching England's experience of cultural and religious change in the years really either side of Henry VIII's Reformation. I'm especially interested in church communities as hubs of not only religious worship, but cultural and social life in provincial England. And my conviction, I suppose, is that it's in these places at ground level that we really begin to understand the profound changes of this very extraordinary moment in our history.
Absolutely. And we are going to be talking about the dissolution of the monasteries. But before we do that, I think it would be helpful if you could just give us an idea of what role the monasteries actually played in everyday life in the 16th century.
Of course. In short, monasteries are everywhere. They are on everybody's horizon in whatever kind of neighbourhood that might be inhabited in Tudor England. In the reign of Henry VIII, there is a monastery, a monastic institution of some or other kind, not very far away. It's difficult to precisely measure that, but nobody, unless they live in the very, very sparsely populated peripheries of the Kingdom of England and Wales, nobody is more than a few miles from one of these institutions. So they are widespread and familiar and widespread in their diversity. There's such a variety of these institutions. We use the generic term monastery, but it's a catch-all for a remarkable range of institutions. So we have great abbeys with large estates, but we also have a large number of really very small monastic institutions, communities of often fewer than a dozen monastic men and women and their staff, their resident employees. And we also have, often forgotten when historians discuss this subject, we also have a large number of friaries, which are especially concentrated in urban areas because friaries, unlike the great old abbeys, didn't own large estates of land and other property that they took income from. They really depended on the charity of the neighborhood, of their neighbors, of the communities they lived alongside. And so, not surprisingly, they tended to be established close to centers of population. What this means is in provincial Henrician England of the 15 teens and 20s and 30s, where most people live, there's not just one monastery or monastic institution, but there is a sort of spectrum of them, a variety from a small community to perhaps somewhere outside of a provincial town, quite a large old abbey, and then maybe one or two friaries. A lot of middle-sized towns and provincial cities in Henry VIII's England are quite literally ringed by these institutions. If you walk through the grid plan streets, you'll meet one or two of these institutions. And then if you break out of the walled town or city through the gate, there will be one or two of them as you make your way to the main roadways out of town. So they are to be seen everywhere in everybody's daily life. What are they for? They are places of worship. These are institutions that people commit to live their lives in, pursuing a holier and more religiously disciplined life. But these are also places where everybody else may go and carry out their religious worship. These are places that are focal points for religious culture more generally. It's often overlooked that a very large number of monastic institutions in Henry VIII's England actually serve a parish function. So ordinary lay people looking to worship in a parish church, that parish church for them, to all intents and purposes, would be a monastery. So a lot of people are going through into their precincts simply to carry out their normal religious routine as good Christians under the king. These places are also known to everybody because of the rooted position they have in the neighborhood. They own property. A lot of people may not have a direct personal relationship with a monastery. They may not choose to go and worship in their church, but they'll still be paying rent to them. They are their landlord. A lot of properties, not just farm properties out in the countryside, but urban property, urban tenements that a good many of Henry VIII's subjects now live in, they are owned by monastic institutions. And so many people would have known them purely and simply as landlords, as the people who own the roof over their head and they have to pay rent to. For many people, they're also employers because monasteries are large institutions and large institutions that are self-sufficient. They bring in and buy their food. They must employ staff to manage all aspects of institutional life while the core community of monastic men and women are carrying out their religious routines. And so a good many people in any locality will either be employed directly by a monastery or their own livelihood in some way will be connected to them. So it may be that the produce that they buy and sell in the marketplace is being bought, among others, by the monastery. And of course, large monastery institutions are major consumers. And so in the growing, increasingly prosperous, dynamic economy of the early 16th century in England, these are a major presence in provincial economic life. Then there's another dimension I'd highlight for the place that these institutions occupy on people's horizons, and that is their sort of social and cultural function. Most monasteries of men in Henry VIII's England have opened up schools, sometimes quite informally, and only to teach the very basics of Latin literacy to a small number of the deserving poor boys that live locally. But some of them are rather more ambitious and formal than that, and actually take in dozens of boys and are beginning to function rather like the institutionalized grammar schools that we see being founded later in the Tudor period, in the reign of Edward VI and Elizabeth I. So this provides centres of population with a major social and cultural resource, a place of education. They're also providing forms of social welfare, which is what we would call that today. They are providing charity in the two classic forms of charitable outlay. That is charity that is out relief, that is giving charity to those who come to the gates of the monastery and then move on, but also providing charitable support and shelter for a number who are actually welcomed inside the monastery. And we know that not only wealthy monasteries carry out these charitable functions, but also even those friaries that are dependent themselves on the gifts of local people. And in fact, in some cities, the city governors report that the friaries play a particularly important role, especially in times of plague. The friaries are prepared to open up their precincts, to open up their grounds, and actually let in those in need at a time when everybody else is of course barring their doors and hoping for the pandemic to pass them by. So again, even if a resident of provincial England did not know somebody in their own family network who had taken vows and was living as a monk or a nun or a friar, nor necessarily themselves worshipped in one of their churches, almost certainly another aspect of their life, economic or social or cultural, would have been touched by these places.
And before we talk about why Henry chose to dissolve them, considering everything you've said and that they sound vital to society and the people living at the time, I was wondering if you could just touch on the history of dissolving and suppressing monasteries in England and maybe continental precedents too, because I do feel that there is this sort of misconception that what Henry did was something novel. So I'd love you to go into that a little bit.
Yes. So monasteries are institutions, and medieval Europe, medieval society was very familiar with institutions rising and falling, coming and going. Institutions are only as secure as the resources available to support them. And it was not a revolutionary, almost unthinkable proposition that an institution might be deemed no longer viable. Medieval people, early modern people, were thoroughly familiar with the idea that an institution, a site, a building, an infrastructure on their own high street, as it were, might be there in one generation and in the next generation be gone. We shouldn't forget, of course, that this society had, over relatively recent generations, by the beginning of the 16th century, had passed through cataclysms, not least the attack and then return of the pestilence in the 14th century, which had laid waste not just to populations, but to the infrastructure around them, to whole parishes, whole villages. And so I think we often somehow paint in a picture of pre-Reformation society as somehow untouched until this revolutionary process takes hold. But it's simply not the case. Just as I think we're often reminded when we visit a great medieval cathedral or abbey church, that for much of the Middle Ages themselves, these buildings were rather unfinished. They were covered in scaffolding and nothing was ever quite as we see it subsequently. Well, the same is true of communities. Communities would have been marked by gaps in the skyline where some former institution had been taken down. Monasteries had been dissolved by the monastic movement themselves. They were the very first, always, to determine if an institution was no longer viable, there wasn't enough money coming in from its property to support it, or very commonly, there weren't enough men or women taking vows coming forward to actually live the life. And monastic leaders in the Middle Ages worry a great deal about, as it were, where the next generation of monks or nuns is coming from. So everybody is very familiar with a rise and fall and with monastic institutions being removed. In England, there'd been moments where this had happened long before Henry VIII's reign on a large scale. During the ongoing conflict between England and France that we now know as the 100 Years' War between the 1330s and the 1440s, in fact, the English crown had systematically closed and seized the property of a whole succession of monasteries that had been the property of larger abbeys in mainland France, just as in many conflicts in the modern era, foreign nationals are interned or turned out and turned away during a period of warfare. This is what happens with these monasteries that are essentially the outposts of French monasteries. And in the 15th century, England is dealing with the aftermath of that. And in fact, that process models what we see in Henry VIII's Reformation, because those seized French monasteries and their properties are actually used and sort of recycled to create new institutions. So colleges and schools emerge out of those seized monasteries. So in many ways, by the beginning of the 16th century, there is a well-established precedent for institutions being taken down if they're no longer considered to be either viable or needed. And even early in Henry VIII's reign, this decision to close monastic institutions on grounds of non-viability had been advanced by Henry VIII's first chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Now, Wolsey is not on principle opposed to people living in monasteries, but Wolsey, like many church leaders of his generation, is very committed to the notion that the church, if it's going to continue to be resilient, must ensure that the only churches, the only institutions, the only communities of clergy that are there are wholly viable, properly funded, not dependent only on charity or on meagre estates. And so he sets out to close very small monasteries. In some cases, some of those he closes no longer have anyone living in them at all. So this is not an assault on some lively and vigorous institution. It is very much tidying up around the edges. So by the time of Henry VIII's break with Rome and his declaration of himself as supreme governor of an English church, Henry is certainly not short of precedents, of established processes for tackling rationalization in this church that he's taken over. In fact, you might say, ironically, that Henry has got more examples and models of how to rationalize his church than he has of his other great matter, that is the divorce. He is facing a much greater challenge in trying to find legal precedent for the argument he's making to the Roman papacy to divorce Catherine and Aragon than he actually finds that he has when it comes to these other measures of rationalization.
So you've obviously told us that Henry has all these examples, but why does he specifically decide to dissolve them and this sort of widespread annihilation, essentially, of the monasteries? What are his motivations?
Well, I'd start, I think, by taking issue somewhat with the premise that Henry sets out to dissolve all monasteries. In the early 1530s, I don't think that is his plan. I think that he is, in becoming supreme governor of the church, much more at first focused on renewing, restarting and extending the process of rationalization that had been a key policy of Wolsey's. Henry's view of the church, I think for most of this decade of the 1530s, in fact, is to a great extent Wolsey's vision. I think recent historians writing about Thomas Cromwell have emphasized how much Cromwell in his plans owes to his old master Wolsey. Well, I think the same can be said of Henry himself. I think Henry is a committed traditional English Catholic in the sense of being committed to the forms of worship that he grew up with. but like many of his generation, touched by the reforming message of humanist churchmen like Erasmus, who briefly is Henry's tutor as a young man. Henry does believe that this church for a new century must rationalize. It must renew itself in order to be resilient. And so what he sets out to achieve first and foremost is the trimming away of the waste. And he is convinced, and perhaps convinced more than is the reality, he's convinced that across provincial England, there are a good many more utterly unviable, utterly, frankly, pointless monastic institutions and probably other church institutions than Wolsey had barely been able to deal with. And he's encouraged in that view by his councillors, by those around him. A good many of the bishops serving Henry and supporting his supreme governorship of the church take this view too. They report that in their diocese there are monastic institutions with just one or two monks or nuns, where there's suspicion and muttering of mismanagement of resources, where they don't seem to be offering the neighbourhood very much in the way of the kinds of services that I've discussed. And that's his first objective. Henry, only later in the 1530s, becomes gradually more and more convinced that there's another problem with the monasteries. Not that simply there are too many of them and we need to rationalize and make sure the ones that we have are the ones that fulfill all of these functions in the situation in their neighborhood. As we move into the later 1530s, foremost in Henry's mind for his whole church policy is a steadily rising paranoia that the general acceptance of his supreme governorship of the church that he achieved in the active supremacy of 1534 is beginning to crumble, is beginning to fracture. That in fact, the impression that he had at the end of 1534, when that active supremacy passed Parliament and the clergy of England stepped forward to accept it formally, that acceptance was more apparent than real. And Henry has plenty of signals in front of him by, let's say, 1538 especially, that might be the case. Of course, most conspicuous of all, he's seen rebellion in the Midlands and the north of England. That, in his mind, could be a signal of something more than just a challenge to his taxation policy and a challenge to Thomas Cromwell's interventions in provincial society. It could be an indication to him that, in fact, maybe not as many of his subjects really were invested in his grand project for an English church under his leadership. And hard on the heels of that large-scale rebellion are rumours of many others, rumours of conspiracies. In the autumn of 1538, one of his longest-serving favourites, Henry, Marquess of Exeter, Henry Courtenay, who he'd grown up with in boyhood, who was his cousin, is discovered, suspected of planning a conspiracy against him. As we move into the winter of 1538, Henry's paranoia that maybe those near to him and far, as it were, out there in provincial society, maybe they don't subscribe to the vision of 1534 in the way that he hoped they did. And increasingly, the focus of that paranoia becomes sort of trained on the remaining monasteries. And there's no shortage of rumours to encourage that view that maybe the monasteries, as long as they stand, are sort of fomenting this challenge, this questioning of his leadership of the church and of the break with Rome. And certainly Cromwell takes the view by the end of 1538, 1539, that it may be, given Henry's hardening point of view, it may be an easier course of action to steer towards complete closure than to somehow convince Henry that some of these institutions could be reconstituted and actually play a key role in Henry's church. But that conviction that none of these should remain comes on even Cromwell and Henry only very gradually. And it's clear from Cromwell's notes and memoranda that we have surviving that he's continuing to talk to some of the largest, best managed, wealthiest monasteries about the roles that they might play in this new church, some of them perhaps being raised to the level of cathedral to give them a leadership role in the provinces. And those plans are still there as late as the winter of 1538 into 1539. And some of the principal monasteries, even in the following winter, are continuing to believe that they are reading the signals correctly coming from the centre of government, that a portion of their number will still have a place in Henry's church. Because in their minds, they genuinely did support the vision of 1534. And in their minds, they had done nothing to indicate that they withdrew that support. They see less of Henry's paranoia. What they do see still, even in late 1539, is an opportunity for them to serve the king in this new non-Roman church. So we have to, I think, see, as we so often in the history of Henry VIII, we have to see different faces of Henry as we move through the 1530s. The Henry of 1534-35 wants to pick up the baton from his old chief minister Wolsey and continue to rationalise the church that he now leads. Henry, after the Pilgrimage of Grace and in the face of conspiracy, even conspiracy in his own court in 1538, is inclined more and more to think that the monasteries are fomenting discord. By 1539 into 40, that is reaching a kind of fever pitch. But even then, Cromwell certainly has not given up on the idea that maybe we retain a number of these institutions as it were, exemplars of what a rationalized and thoroughly reformed church could be.
Yeah, that's so interesting and such insightful, thought-provoking comments there. I have to say, James, maybe just to play devil's advocate, of course, when talking about the dissolution and Henry's motivations, a lot of the times people will cite greed. You yourself highlighted earlier the wealth of some of these monasteries and that they're huge landowners. Do you think that played a role, or do you think that also kind of came into it perhaps a little bit later in the story?
Well, certainly the wealth of monasteries has always played a role in the English monarchy's dealings with them. And I think there again, we perhaps create for ourselves a sort of false dividing line or separation between Henry's policy and those of his predecessors. Monasteries, like any endowed institution, that is, an institution that is set up with property that it can hold in perpetuity, is a very tempting prize for any monarch. And throughout England's medieval history, we have seen monarchs not only give to these institutions to set them up, but when it suits them, to take away as well. What Henry with Wolsey had established was a modus operandi of asserting more and more royal authority over these institutions so as to compel them sometimes to give up a particularly choice or lucrative property, maybe to exchange it for another one with the crown. And Henry is doing this merrily through the 1520s and into the early 1530s. So certainly, in looking at monasteries, he looks with, as it were, pound signs in his eyes. There's no doubt. But that's not the same as assuming that the best way of capitalizing on their wealth is to close them. Henry and his ministers are well aware that monasteries acquire their properties not just from the crown, from Henry's illustrious predecessors, but also from other landowners, from the nobility and gentry across the country and many, many different families. And Henry, who is, after all, the son of a usurping king, is acutely conscious of the political delicacy of interfering in property transactions that were not his own or his predecessors. And so my feeling is that for much of the 1530s, Henry is content with reminding these institutions that they fall under his authority, interfering and intervening over their property and their sources of income, ad hoc, targeting particular properties when it suits him and asserting his authority in doing so. And even after the smaller and less viable monasteries have been closed in 1536 and 1537, for the next 18 months or so, it does look as though he and Cromwell are going to continue to work in that way, because they are well aware that some sweeping strike at all of that property in one fell swoop is not feasible practically, and politically it would be utterly self-destructive. Because what would they seize? They would seize some crown property that had originally come from a monarch to a monastery, but a great deal of it wouldn't have touched royalty, would have come from the political nation, as it were. And in fact, even in the closure of the smaller monasteries, there have been expressions of outrage coming from that political nation. The crown can't march in and sequester property that never came from the crown in the first place. Henry and Cromwell are well aware of that critique that is there. I think also, when we look in retrospect at what the crown actually ultimately does take financially from the closure of monasteries, what becomes clear is another danger that even if it wasn't present in Henry's mind, was surely present in Cromwell's, which is that the Tudor monarchy draws a good deal of its income from taxation. As long as church institutions, including monasteries, stand with all of the landed estates that they hold, the tax take for the crown, when it can levy a charge on the church through convocation, the church's parliament, is very substantial, very significant. And one of the reasons that Henry, as a young king, inherits from his father a kingdom that is well and truly in the black, is solvent, is because of that tax income, that tax dividend. By the 1540s, with the closure of monasteries, no longer there with property to pay tax to the king, Henry has decimated his tax income. So I find it difficult to accept that a legally and financially astute brain such as Thomas Cromwell has not overlooked the fact that sudden and sweeping assaults on the monastic estate actually do damage to the crown's finances. And that must play a part in this incremental approach that I've described, this sense that maybe the wealthiest institutions, the grandest, the oldest, the most distinguished, should find a place in some other form. I'm sure that must be a reason why Cromwell is, as it were, on the back of an envelope, sketching ideas for new cathedrals built out of monasteries. So it's going to be politically much easier to sell to the political nation the idea that the monasteries, the wealthiest, haven't gone, they've just been reconstituted, they've been remade or reinvented, which is why he surely holds on to the idea for as long as he does.
And let's talk a little bit more about how they actually went about this gradual closure of the monasteries. I'm sure lots of our listeners have probably heard about the Valor ecclesiasticus. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about how this grand survey was conducted and what information it actually provided to the crown, or what were they collecting?
I'd be tempted to call the Valor ecclesiasticus, which is a rather cumbersome name for this process. I'd be tempted to call it the Tudor Doomsday. Many people, I'm sure, will be familiar with Domesday Book, with William the Conqueror's survey of land and property and income in 1086 to assess the kingdom that over the previous 20 years he conquered. Now, Henry VIII's great survey of the church, carried out in the spring and summer of 1535, is very much undertaken in the same spirit as William the Conqueror's Doomsday, in the sense that Henry's not a new king in 1535, but he is entering into a new position. Just at the close of the previous year, he has become supreme governor of a new English church. And the Valor Ecclesiasticus is his very first step in that new role, in that new capacity. And it's a very logical first step. If you've entered into a new domain, and Henry has. He's entered into a new domain. He's become leader of this English church, now detached from Rome. You want to audit what your new domain amounts to, what is in it, and what is it worth. And this is what the Valor is. It is a systematic account compiled of the property owned by church institutions in England and Wales, the income that that property generates, how that income is distributed, beginning to investigate that, of course, not all of it, in fact, comes directly to the church institution itself, but there are other beneficiaries involved, and capturing quite a lot of ancillary details of the nature of church property. I think it's highly unlikely that Henry pored over every page of it very closely, but had he done so, he would have discovered the extraordinary variety of sources of income that this new Tudor church, in fact, claims, not only, as we would expect, large areas of agricultural estates, farmland, growing crops, raising livestock, and so on, but also a good deal of urban property. Also, a remarkable array of industrial activity. So we find in the Valor Ecclesiasticus that there are monasteries in the Midlands in England that are the beneficiaries of really very early pioneering open cast coal mining, for example. So it really captures at a fine grain level how the church economy operates. And I have to say, from a historian's point of view, it is every bit as fascinating as Doomsday Book, in that we not only see the description of an economic system, but we do see a good deal of the people and the things that make that system work. So the people who are the bailiffs of that manor, or who are the reeves on that farm, we see some of the Valor surveyors are so conscientious. We see even how many livestock of one kind or another are on a particular area of land. We can count the sheep of these great church estates. It has the potential to provide us with really a snapshot of Henry VIII's England that we simply don't have from any other source. And if you begin to dig into it, just as you do with Doomsday Book, and take the survey return for a particular locality, you can quite literally sort of paint into the landscape the large numbers of sheep that were over there, the crop of oats that was growing in those fields. There's some remarkable observations that surveyors make. There's one surveyor who notes certain fields that always flood in the winter and so can't be used. We learn of the names that traditionally were given to those charity cases who were supported by a particular monastery, those who, entertainingly, those who actually live in and receive charity as sort of resident alms people are called friars, and those who only receive out relief apparently are called half friars. So these snippets of detail are extraordinarily fascinating. Of course, it's not the ground level lived experience that Henry's surveyors were providing to the Crown. What the Crown wants to understand is where the wealth is concentrated, certainly also where is no longer viable. And the Valor survey undoubtedly spotlights institutions that are barely keeping their institutional head above water, that simply don't have sufficient income to support themselves. And in the first instance, this survey is surely intended to inform what then will follow over the next 12 to 18 months, which is a plan to pick up that process of closure of small monasteries that Wolsey had begun and to extend it further.
And so once this survey is done, what are those legal and administrative steps that Henry takes in order to dissolve the monasteries? We've said that this obviously happens over a period of time. What are the sort of key moments there?
So hard on the heels of the valuation survey of the church, the Valor or Ecclesiasticus, Henry launches a visitation of church institutions. Now, this again is the next logical step, putting into effect the powers that he has given himself in the Act of Supremacy. In fact, the preamble to the Act of Supremacy is explicit about the power that he has assumed and does make specific reference to the Crown as Supreme Governor having the right to conduct a visitation of church institutions. Now, a visitation itself was not a new measure of governance. The church across the Middle Ages, and not just in England, of course, across the whole of Europe, had used the instrument of visitation to govern its churches, cathedrals, monasteries, parish churches, all forms of church institution. A visitation was simply a process by which the institution's operations were scrutinized by external surveyors, usually appointed by the church hierarchy, the bishop, or the hierarchy of the monastic orders, to really weigh and measure what the strengths and weaknesses of the operations of the institution were, and to implement changes where problems were identified. The revolution in Henry's measure then is not the process of visitation, but the fact that it's being carried out by a secular, that is, not by a member of the church hierarchy, but by crown officials and by lawyers, men with a clerical training, rather than by churchmen. And what would have been wrong footing for church institutions when the visitation starts rolling out in the late spring, early summer of 1535 is indeed the fact that a process that they were very familiar with and were accustomed to was suddenly not in the hands of fellow clergy, but in the hands of these men who had far less experience of church life and were not churchmen for the most part themselves. Henry uses this visitation, which spreads nationwide, to gather, again, detailed evidence of the condition of these institutions. And that evidence is really gathered to complement what the valuation survey has already gathered. Valuation survey tells Henry's regime about those institutions that are viable and non-viable. The visitation information adds to that an impression of the viability of the human resource. That is to say, the monastic men and women who live in these institutions. How well are they performing their roles? Are they suitable to those roles? The visitors are expected to find out, for example, what the age range of a monastic community is. Have they got a sufficient number of men or women of an appropriate age to carry out all of the duties of a monastic institution? And in some instances, they find the answer to that is emphatically no. They're either very elderly or they're very young, and there isn't anyone of a sufficient level of experience or capability to carry out tasks. That information is combined with the Valor ecclesiasticus to guide Cromwell, especially, and we have to think that this is being led by Cromwell, through the winter of 1535 into the early spring of 1536, to plan a formal process of closure of those monasteries deemed, on the basis of all of this evidence, no longer to be viable financially or in the matter of their performance as a community. And this is presented to Parliament in 1536 to reinforce a proposal for a draft statute that will compel the closure of monasteries with an annual income of less than £200. Now, that captures a significant number of monasteries, but by no means the totality of monastic foundations in England. And again, is consistent with earlier processes, not just what Wolsey was beginning to do in the 1520s, but what monastic authorities themselves had tended to do, had tended to look at institutions. If the reports of the way that the inmates conducted themselves or the reports of the income were bad, then there would be a view to closing them. So Henry's measures are gathering evidence, demonstrating to his subjects that he had indeed granted himself these powers of visitation, and then using that to inform a parliamentary statute that empowers him. But it should be emphasized what that's empowered is something that in many ways, again, is by no means unprecedented. And it's always hard, given that we know how this story ultimately ends in the 1540s, to credit. But I think we do have to understand that even as small monasteries with a low income were being persuaded to give themselves up in the summer and autumn of 1536 under this statute, the vast majority of monasteries unaffected by this are confident that this is a trimming and a rationalization, and they will have a place in Henry's church nonetheless. And in fact, it's not systematic. Small monasteries that technically should be forced to close under the terms of this statute are able to secure a dispensation to carry on. Where those monasteries have very good relations with the local neighborhood, with benefactors, patrons whose families have always supported them, they very easily find that they can present enough support to the crown and, of course, a cash sweetener to persuade Cromwell's agents that they should move along and allow them to continue. So it's a patchy process of closure. No doubt Cromwell pictured large-scale closures of non-viable monasteries, just like had happened in the past. But what actually is the outcome is some way short of that. And in the autumn of 1536, long before the terms of the statute have been enforced across the country, it's entirely interrupted by the eruption of rebellion, the rebellion we call the Pilgrimage of Grace in the Midlands and the North. So it's manifestly a stop-start process. And by the end of 1536, it's definitely more stop than start.
And obviously, we've talked a lot about Thomas Cromwell. You've mentioned him so many times. So I was wondering if you could tell us what your thoughts are on his role and what is his official role in this, but also how active is the king in this process? Because, sometimes you see people online saying things like it wouldn't have happened without Thomas Cromwell, these sorts of things. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, Cromwell certainly is at the center of this action. Cromwell's hand is all over the drafting of statutes in this period, and Cromwell's behind the selection of those crown officials. They're called commissioners who carry out the visitation and indeed the Valor before it. And Cromwell is coordinating a network out there in provincial England who are gathering this evidence and then beginning the process of forced closure in the autumn of 1536. Exactly what is in Cromwell's mind, on the other hand, continues to be quite elusive because we have such a limited amount of written evidence of Cromwell's planning. The vast majority of the letters written by Cromwell don't survive, and as his recent biographers have suggested, it's quite likely, perhaps very likely, that there is a deliberate process of destroying a lot of Cromwell's paperwork when he is arrested. So we have to piece together his hand in the implementation of these closures from the point of view of those who carried it out on his behalf, because their letters back to him survive in good number. What we take from those letters time and again is that Cromwell was communicating to them maybe what we might describe as the bigger picture and the headlines, but a good deal of the detail of the process was not, if it was in Cromwell's mind at all, it certainly wasn't finding its way down to those who, on the hoof, were going around on county circuits, either gathering evidence or then attempting to enforce closure. And they meet so many obstacles on the way and frequently are sending off fast and furious dispatches to Cromwell asking for guidance, which clearly doesn't come. So I do think we have to qualify the reputation that perhaps especially Hilary Mantel has given Thomas Cromwell as the consummate and very precise manager and fixer, because the letters of his agents, his commissioners, don't lie. Cromwell is a powerful man. It seems unlikely to me that they would say, you must give us more instruction, if they didn't indeed feel that they were lacking instruction. So in some respects, I dare to suggest that Cromwell's position is not so far from Henry's, in that his view of what's happening is changeable. He is often in a reactive mode. He so often, and I think we do see this in some of his high political dealings too, he's so often testing the water, or I suppose today in managerial speak we'd say he's flying a kite. He's seeing what might come of an initiative, and he's not afraid to pull back. So I do think we have to sketch a Thomas Cromwell who is not a man with a fine printed blueprint that he is implementing to the last detail, but rather somebody who is not afraid to let lines of action unfold and sometimes draw them back in again, and not afraid to allow a policy to evolve. I wonder whether the reason that 21st century students of history and readers and viewers are so drawn to this man is that maybe his politics is not so far different from the politics that we all witness today, of politicians being charged with huge ambition, but much of the time actually making policy on the hoof. And I think there is an element of that here.
And in terms of resistance, James, because obviously we've talked about that there's a lot of turmoil during these years. Could you tell us a little bit about what resistance there is to these new policies and to this gradual, more widespread closure of the monasteries?
I think the short answer is there's more resistance, and across a wider spread of the country than has often been acknowledged in standard history narratives of this period. Of course, the uprising of the Pilgrimage of Grace looms large, and it is significant, and it is a shock, as I've said, that I think resounds in Henry for not just months, but years afterwards, because his most revolutionary step, making himself Supreme Governor of the Church, is so openly challenged in that eruption of rebellion and violence, reoccupying of some monastery sites, and so on. And in the number of members of the political nation, gentry, rallying to that rebel cause, which is deeply shocking to a man who really sort of depends on outward demonstrations of obedience from his immediate subjects. There's clearly within the monastic network all kind of levels of resistance, both active in that I found evidence that in southern and western parts of the country, there are monastics who are giving very close attention to the uprising. In the north, there's some suggestion that some of those who escape from the Crown's forces come into the south of England and are given protection there by sympathetic monastics. But there's also a very substantial body of evidence of what we might call sort of sabotage of Henry and Cromwell's plans. I've said that in the middle 1530s and probably as late as up to 1538-39, what Henry and Cromwell want to do with the remaining monasteries is squeeze them as hard as they can to target particular prized properties, to make them ever more convinced that they exist only under royal authority and that the Crown can take their income at will. But monasteries from as early as 1535 are subverting that very actively. They are taking steps to place their property in the hands of some of their supporters, their long-standing patronal families, but also in the hands of those who are their stewards, their bailiffs, their tenants of various kinds. They are doing everything they can to ensure that in the immediate, if the Crown comes after a particular property, the Crown can't get it because it's actually been leased to somebody else. And should the situation take a sudden turn in another direction, in a more challenging direction, and the Crown come after them in their entirety, that the Crown will find that a good deal of the really valuable property is tied up in one or other legal transaction, and it's very difficult for the Crown to take. Now, that process is suspected of being carried out by a number of Cromwell's agents, and the letters that come back to Cromwell report suspicions in different parts of the country. Some of them are reporting a kind of despair that should we want to take that monastery over there, we'll find that a good deal of its property has completely been transacted away and the Crown won't be able to sequester it. And when, from 1538 onwards, closures begin to happen at a more regular pace, time and time again, this is found that what the Crown is able to take hold of isn't the whole portfolio of properties, because all sorts of steps have been taken, often them quite outrageously illegal, to ensure that the Crown can't get hold of this property. These outrageous forms of resistance or sabotage, where blank parchment documents are created with wax seals ready-made and attached to them, which are then distributed clandestinely so that those who are part of the network of associates of a monastery can write themselves out an apparently legal conveyance giving them a claim to a property. So as and when the Crown commissioners arrive, they won't be able to lay their hands on that property because that individual will be able to produce an apparently bona fide document saying that they have a legal claim to it. And this happens all over. The Crown does try to meet this resistance through its own legal measures, through the courts. But as with any litigation, it takes time. And Henry's remaining years are marked by unresolved legal disputes over whose property it is that has gone from a monastery, but now appears to be in the hands of some third party. And in fact, the English Crown is continuing to pursue properties that have been concealed away in this form of resistance as far as the 19th century. The last cases of recovering concealed lands are brought through the courts early in the 19th century. So, as is so often the case, I guess, in history, here it is not the most eye-catching and certainly not the most bloody forms of resistance that arguably are the most important. Mm-hmm. And these are the ones that, I suppose it's not surprising, historians have been quite slow to put together a picture of, because really we in our research have to do the very same thing that the Crown's lawyers had to do for generations, which is to try and piece together the path of some prized property whisked away under the eyes of the Crown commissioners and into the hands of some local family, never really to come close to the Crown again. And this is another reason why we have to say that there is no way that Henry VIII made himself rich from closing monasteries. Even before we think about his utterly self-destructive decimation of his tax dividend, the fact is that provincial society has no great love for a government in Westminster. Provincial society take matters into their own hands.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's certainly not the form of resistance we see depicted on television very often or in novels. You know, that's why I find that really interesting.
No, it doesn't make necessarily a very visual spectacle. No. A series of people writing out conveyances, but the impact of this resistance is immense.
Yeah, amazing. And so obviously there's challenges in claiming some of those assets owned by these monasteries, as you've already pointed out. What about the actual monastic buildings, like the main monastic buildings and the lands there? What happens to them following the sort of final closure of those big abbeys?
Well, when we see monastic ruins today, it's very tempting to assume that this is a broken, tumbled building that was assaulted almost literally by Henry VIII. And I must admit, when I visit some of these sites, you know, there's usually a guide that tells you that this was broken as if personally by Henry VIII. It is a completely false impression. What happens immediately after the last monastics and resident staff have filed out of the precinct is that these buildings, for the most part, are mothballed. They are kept while the ownership of the different component parts of of what in many cases an area covering a good many acres, with lots of different buildings, while the future ownership of these structures is decided. As a growing number of sites are in this state, are closed, they are empty of people, they are now being administered by the Crown. The instructions coming out of the regime are for the main parts of the building to be left intact. Henry and Cromwell are particularly interested in the high value raw materials that make up these buildings. They're especially interested in the lead sheets that cover the roof and form a good deal of the guttering and the downpipes and so forth. But the instructions that come out to the Crown's commissioners active at ground level is leave this in place. Indeed, when locals take matters into their own hands and start removing some of these raw materials or taking down part of a building, the instructions that come particularly out of the Court of Augmentations, which is headed by Richard Rich. Rich's instructions, and we have a good number of Rich's letters, he's always exasperated and he's always letting rip in his letters to say very ferociously, leave everything where it is. And he is outraged and threatens that action will be taken against those who attempt to remove materials. So by the early to mid 1540s, the striking thing in walking through Henry VIII's Reformation England would have been a large number of these sites standing empty, but standing whole, standing complete. And in fact, in a good many instances across different parts of the country, that would have persisted for a generation, possibly two. I think with the combined work of archival research and archaeological research, the view that we're coming to now is if there is a moment in which a large number of these standing buildings are toppled, it's not the 1530s and 40s, but it's a good 60 to 70 years later, that it's in that generation, really down to the death of James, perhaps even in some instances to the Civil War period, when we finally see sites really being quite significantly altered and the skyline changing and gaps and spaces opening up on familiar parts of a townscape or a cityscape. Before that time, there would have been a curious atmosphere of stasis, as it were, of suspended animation, where buildings were empty, but they were not. Of course, undoubtedly, bits and pieces were robbed out. There was damage. In some specific instances, commissioners had taken it on themselves to take off a roof or part of a roof. So they weren't looking their best, but they haven't been razed or erased from the landscape. And in a good many instances, ironically, some parts of these buildings continue to be used for their original purpose. This brings me back to a point I made earlier, that many parts of the country, a monastery church is also a place of parish worship for a local community. And in the wake of closures and the removal of the monastics, local people come back and reclaim these places as parish churches. And of course, in some cases, they are ministered to by men who had been monks and friars. And I found a good many cases across the country where a former monastery church has now become the parish church serving a community, and who is standing at the head of the nave at the chancel steps, ministering the mass every week, but none other than one of those who had lived in that church as a monastic. So there is a remarkable degree of continuity in the, as it were, the landscape of monastic England for the generation who lived through the process. And even those who were born after the last living monastery was closed in the spring of 1540. So those who are coming to adulthood in the 1560s, they would have, in many parts of the country, have known fully formed monastic sites. The only thing they were lacking were the resident community.
And I don't think we can conclude conversation about the dissolution without talking about the impact on individuals, and you've obviously touched on that there, and society in general. So what would you say were the sort of main impacts of this process that occurred in the 30s and 40s, 1530s and 40s?
I think we have to start with those who make their living in connection with these places, because those whose livelihoods and places of settled residence was inside or connected to these institutions, which, as I've said, sometimes were sprawling over acres, a cluster of buildings, quite a complex infrastructure. And there were many secular or lay people whose lives and livelihoods were wound and bound around those buildings. They are immediately affected. And we can trace the effects on them, and we can sometimes even hear their voices in the depositions they then make in the years that follow to the Court of Augmentations, more often than not, complaining that they were wrested out of their livelihood and have not received adequate compensation, or in many cases, simply adequate payment. They weren't properly paid off from their role, and they weren't compensated, given that many of them, their employed role came with accommodation and with sometimes a livery and so on. And they do make their way well into the 1540s, into the Court of Augmentations, to try and recover something of what they've lost, and they are well documented. So the first people to be thoroughly upheaved in many ways are not those who lived under vows as monks, friars, and nuns. For the men who were monastics, there is a notable degree of continuity. Yes, certainly, the place that they have devoted years, much of their life in some cases, has come to an end, and they have had to leave. But the clerical life, which they chose as late teenagers in most cases, and the priesthood, which the vast majority of them had committed to, they were ordained as priests, that continued. They've not lost that status. Most male monastics secure a license from the Archbishop of Canterbury to continue their careers as clergy, as ordained priests, and to minister in the wider church outside of a monastic setting. And a good many of them do find positions. They find appointments, anything from parish priests, and quite a number of them rise all the way to become bishops. Again, one of the many ironies of this story is that in the last years of Henry VIII's reign, some of the most prominent bishops in his new English church that he's the supreme governor of are themselves ex-monastic or ex-friar clergy. And so the monastic presence hasn't disappeared. It's been redeployed. It's a different picture for women. And I think there's a case to be made, not just for monastic women, but the impact, the immediate impact of Reformation on England's society and culture really should encourage us to focus especially on the position of women. After all, the female dimension of worship is steadily stripped out by the process of Reformation. All of those female saints, the status of celibacy under vows, virginity, of, as it were, the solitary marriage of the professed nun, all of that is gone. The condition and capacity, spiritual capacity especially, of women has been diminished by the Reformation, philosophically as much as practically. But the women monastics, their treatment is almost the sort of inverse of the men. The men, in many ways, look forward to a high degree of continuity to ease this change in their circumstances. The women have the worst kind of continuity and the worst kind of discontinuity. The worst kind of continuity is that as long as Henry lives, they are not permitted to marry, whilst the men are allowed to change their vows, in the language of the time, to become members of the wider church, secular clergy. The women are deemed to remain in their vows for life. So they don't have the obvious practical opportunity in front of them of marrying and therefore securing their livelihoods for the future. So they are compelled to remain under vows, but they have no opportunity, of course, to enter the church. In a sense, as nuns in the Middle Ages, there was a female clergy. Now, in the Reformed Church, there is none. Their options are to return to their family, which I always feel, to their great credit, a good many of them don't want to do, with all of the supervision and control that that would have implied. Or for those who leave a monastery closed in the last phases, in receipt of a small pension, and the women accept the superiors, the abbesses and priestesses, they receive pensions that are rather lower than the men. The men are given pensions at the same sort of level as a parish priest's income. The women are not. They must find a way of living on their pensions. What we do find, and this evidence has come to light in really only in recent years, we do find them living together in groups. And one of the most touching, I think, almost poignant aspects of the fate of the monastic women is the way that they seem to almost cleave together, creating a sort of informally improvising a female community, the very kind of community they've just been taken away from, recreating it by pooling their pension resources and living in a household as a community of women. We can't know whether, as they do that, they attempt to recreate some aspect of their religious life together. But it is striking how they do have a continuing sense of a common shared bond with one another. But overall, they are very difficult to trace. Few of them secure the quantity of personal wealth that enables them or requires them to leave a written will. So whilst it's possible to find through will evidence a good many former monks and friars, former nuns are much, much harder to find. They crop up most often in the wills of family members. And it's from those that we begin to see what their fortunes were. You do find fathers, for example, making reference to leaving a sum of money so his daughter, a former nun, is able to live independently, sometimes with an instruction to the elder brother who's going to inherit the whole estate that he must make provision for his sister. Of course, whether he ever did, we don't always know. So we glimpse them from time to time, but most vividly when we find them coming together as a group to live. But as in so many aspects of female experience in religion, there's no doubt that they are the losers of this process.
And I would recommend to our listeners, by the time our episode is published, there will be another one that I think complements this beautifully. And it's a conversation with Dr. Brona McShane about Irish nuns and the impact the dissolution had on them. So I highly recommend you tune into that one too. But James, you've been so incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much. I have the final question is just in regards to misconceptions. And I think we've touched on many of them, but what do you think is one of the most prevalent that still remains surrounding the dissolution?
Well, if you'll allow me, I think there are two that I want to mention. I think one is this notion that it is an event. Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the traditional school child's history will say. As I've argued, and as I've argued in my recent book, this is a process that, as it were, creeps its way through the 1530s. And it's not even something that is fully formed in Cromwell's mind until late in that decade, if not until the spring of 1540. So it's not an event. It's a process. It's a negotiation. It's messy and in many ways is unresolved. I think the second misconception does relate to the physical footprint of these places. That monastic England has been silenced in the spring of 1540. There are no longer monastic men and women in choirs performing their offices. But it's not disappeared. It's not been taken down. It has fallen silent. It's been stifled, but it's not been erased. And if we want to understand later Henrician England and the England of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, we need to picture a landscape in which these places remain and many of their people remain and play a part in that notionally post-Reformation world.
And you mentioned your book there, of course. So what's the title of your book, James?
So it's called The Dissolution of the Monasteries, A New History.
Wonderful. I'm sure many of our listeners are going to purchase that to find out more about all of the incredible things we've been talking about. And the very last thing, and I promise you I'll let you get on with your evening, is the takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway. So something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Okay, yes. Again, I'm going to claim to anyone who is visiting London at any point, I would urge them, if they see no other site, to head to the crypt chapel of the former monastery of St. John at Clerkenwell to see the most remarkable tomb effigy in the crypt, because that is the effigy of a man called William Weston, who died, we're told, suddenly in May 1540. And he, in his death, represents, in many ways, the very last of monastic England, because he was the prior of the Hospitallers order in England. And their fate was quite different to the rest of monastic England. They were only dissolved by a single act of Parliament, and only as late as the early summer of 1540. And it was said that Weston, who was already an old man, was so shocked by this news that he, as it were, upped and died almost at once. And you can see his effigy. It's one of those wonderful cadaver tombs where you see the decomposing corpse, an expression of what was at the absolute heart of the monastic ideal in the Middle Ages, the idea of contemptus mundi, contempt for the world, withdrawal from the world, denial of the self in order to serve the higher spiritual purpose. But he encapsulates in that tomb really the story that I want to tell of the dissolution, of surprise, of not complete planning, but of surprise, of something that really only becomes certain late on in the period that we know of as the Henrician Reformation. So there he is as a reminder that we should not make easy and straightforward assumptions about how this process unfolded. My other would be anyone who is visiting a wonderful Tudor property, and anyone who is a Tudor fanatic like I am will surely, if you've not been there, you will want to go there. And that's the home of the wonderful Bess of Hardwick Hall, which stands high on the hill in Derbyshire, in the Midlands of England. At Hardwick Hall, and you must go there if you are a self-respecting Tudor fanatic, everybody has to go there, you will see the most extraordinary textiles decorating the walls on the grand staircase, and then in many of the public chambers and even in the chapel. I'd invite you to look at those textiles very closely because they connect to this story of dissolution. They seem to be the most wonderful applique textiles, creating figures on top of textile fabric backgrounds. But they're made from all of the vestments that came out of the dissolved monasteries. And if you look in the backgrounds, you will see wonderful silks, reds and golds and black from mourning vestments. And Bess and her successive husbands, the second of whom, William Cavendish, was one of Thomas Cromwell's commissioners, they bought these vestments in the great garage sales that were carried out when monasteries were emptied. The buildings weren't taken down, but the contents were taken out. And William Cavendish bought a good many of these. We have them in his account. And they find their way into the interiors that Bess designs at Hardwick. And they're a reminder of the collateral of this story of dissolution. We've talked about buildings, we've talked about people, but what was for many of Henry VIII's subjects too precious to actually see destroyed were the fine furnishings, the fixtures and fittings. And it's remarkable that Tudors who regarded themselves as fine members of this new Anglican church, like Bess of Hardwick herself, they couldn't let go of the fabric of pre-Reformation England.
What wonderful takeaways. And now you've given me an excuse to go back to Hardwick Hall so I can have a closer look at the tapestries. So once again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your expertise and for talking Tudors with us all today.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.